Have you ever wondered what sets elite athletes apart? It's not just talent, it's science. And if you understand that science, you'll have elite athletes begging to train with you because they know that you can get them the results that they want. In this video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about how to train athletes. I'm going to show you the exact methods that I've refined over the past 10 years training over 1,000 athletes, ranging from youth athletes to NBA and NFL players. We're going to start with 2 minutes of essential exercise science knowledge. Then we're going to cover the 3 pillars of athlete training: assessment, training, and recovery. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand how to get the best results from training. Let's start with the 2 minutes of essential exercise science knowledge. Everyone has a combination of 2 different muscle fiber types: slow twitch and fast twitch. Slow twitch muscle fibers are used for training with light weights and endurance activities. Fast twitch fibers are used for fast movements like sprinting and Olympic lifting and medicine ball throws. They're also used for both lifting heavy weights and for lifting weights to failure. Training slow twitch fibers will result in more endurance, whereas training fast twitch fibers will give you more speed and power. It's also important to know that there's a genetic component to this, where some athletes will naturally always have more fast twitch or more slow twitch regardless of training. Speaking of genetics, let's talk about the role that it plays that no one really talks about. Have you ever noticed that rugby athletes tend to have a square face and a wide rib cage? This is a really beneficial body structure for a low center of mass and the power that's required for their sport. By contrast, distance runners have a narrow face and rib cage, and this allows for a higher center of mass with longer legs for efficient running. They also tend to get more diaphragm movement up and down to deliver more oxygen to their smaller frame and muscles. Now, having said this, you can improve anything that you train, and a lot of people exist somewhere in the middle, not on the extremes. But it's likely that you'll go farther in a sport faster if you go with something that you're set up for genetically. Okay, there's one last piece of essential exercise science knowledge that lays the groundwork for the pillars of training. That is understanding how your body makes energy. To keep this simple, our body produces 3 types of energy. The first type would be explosive energy, like a sprinter, for explosive, powerful activities that last less than 10 seconds. The second type would be short-term fuel for something like a 400-meter run or for a hockey player. This is still powerful and explosive, but usually for only about 90 seconds or less. And then the third type is endurance, like a distance runner, and this is where the endurance and the aerobic side of things is really important. Each athlete is going to need a different type of training to these systems depending on what their sport requires. Some may focus on just one system, where other sports like soccer may need a combination of all 3 systems. All right, so now that we understand a little bit of the foundation about how muscles work and how our body produces energy, let's move on to the 3 pillars of athlete training. Pillar number 1 is athlete assessment. Before you can train an athlete effectively, you need to know what their starting point is. I like to think of assessments in 2 different ways. Number 1 would be movement assessment, and then number 2 would be performance testing. There are a lot of different approaches to movement assessment. The one that I take is assessing joint by joint, things like hip flexion, hip internal rotation, external rotation, ankle dorsiflexion, lumbar spine flexion, and more. Learning each of these techniques allows you to specifically find exactly where an athlete's movement is restricted and directly address it. We don't have time today to cover each of these techniques, but we do have a free hip mobility masterclass where I show you the exact techniques that I use to measure hip range of motion and how to address and improve it if it's limited. I'll link it below if you want to check that out. Now, I do have one piece of movement assessment advice that I learned from a mentor that I think is really important to know. If you do this well, your athletes will trust you way more than anyone else they've worked with. And that advice is to always test and retest. What I mean by that is whenever you assess a joint and find a movement restriction, you want to do just one drill before retesting to see if there was a change. This will help both you and the athlete you're working with understand what is working and what isn't. If you do this consistently over time, you'll become an expert at movement assessment. The next critical piece of athlete assessment is performance testing. If we think back to earlier, we said that the body produces energy 3 different ways. We need to test the one that is most specific to the athlete's needs. For example, a sprinter may test 40-meter sprint for acceleration, flying 30-meter sprint for max velocity, and vertical or broad jump for explosiveness. A 400-meter hurdle athlete may test 5 rep max back squat for strength, triple broad jump for power, and also hip mobility. They may also test lactate threshold in a lab. A cross-country runner may test 5K run, 1-minute push-up test for muscular endurance and postural control, and VO2 max in a lab setting. As you can see, it's important to match the testing that an athlete performs with the demands of the sport. This ensures that the training produces the results that will improve sport performance. Learning how to accurately test and analyze test results will help you provide better training to your athletes. Now let's move on to pillar number 2, and that is training. When we talk about training, it can be tempting to just start talking about exercises. The best 10 exercises for cricket or basketball or rugby or whatever. But there are actually 3 really important things that you need to decide before you start choosing any exercises. So this is actually what I do when I start writing a training plan for an athlete. Number 1 is decide on training frequency. This will be determined by goals, training season, training experience, and other life factors. It can range anywhere from 1 time per week for short-term maintenance of strength up to 10 plus training sessions per week. Here are a couple guidelines I follow. For 1 to 2 times per week training, always train full body. This gives you the best chance of making progress. At that frequency, there's just not enough time to start splitting by body part or upper or lower. But when you get to 3 to 4 times per week, then you have some more options, including something like an upper lower split 2 times per week each. Beyond about 4 times per week, typically it's more beneficial for athletes to do dedicated conditioning sessions and skill training sessions rather than more resistance training. But you may have athletes in the gym up to 5 or 6 times per week, maybe in their off season as they're building lean body mass. Okay, once you decide on a training frequency, the next important training decision to make is about training volume. To keep this really simple, I like to think of it like this. I break down training by muscle group. For example, squats, leg extensions, and lunges all work the quadricep muscle group. Importantly, we're only going to count sets that are challenging and really difficult, not warm-up sets and not submaximal or easy sets. So here are the 3 different targets for training volume. Low volume tends to be around 8 to 10 sets per muscle group per week. And this could be good for beginners, or for example, you may do 2 sets of squats and 2 sets of lunges on Monday and Thursday. That might be just enough to maintain your strength or make some gains as a beginner. Remember, those are challenging working sets and you may still have warm-up sets before that. You may also have some other exercises that don't directly work the quads that are more accessory work. Next, we have moderate volume, and this tends to be around 15 sets per muscle group per week. This tends to be a pretty good volume target for most athletes to make gains. For example, you may have 3 sets of squats, 2 sets of lunges, and 2 sets of leg extension, again on Monday and Thursday. This is about 14 sets per week. And then lastly, we have the high volume option, and that's 20 plus sets per muscle group per week. And this could be really good for bulking or for overreaching. For example, we may have 4 sets of hack squats, 3 sets of lunges, 3 sets of leg extension on Monday and Thursday. If you're doing way more volume than this, or you're programming way more volume than this for your athletes, then there's a pretty good chance that the sets that you're programming are not truly maximal and challenging. Remember, for this volume calculation and for this principle to make sense, we only want to count truly challenging sets. All right, so maybe now you have an idea of training frequency and training volume. The last training decision to make is how you're going to do progression. I would typically recommend to progress 1 variable. Most athletes will benefit from progressing intensity week to week. This means keeping the exercises and the sets and reps fairly consistent and focusing on adding weight to the bar. Beginners do benefit from adding more sets and reps until they've worked up to at least that moderate volume. But once you get to that moderate or high volume, there really isn't a lot of benefit to keeping adding more and more volume. Instead, you have to keep adding weight to make more progress. With the athletes that I've worked with, it's been more beneficial to keep that moderate to high volume and really focus on intent and weight on the bar rather than just pushing a whole bunch of different sets on them and variations of exercises that they don't really need. Okay, once you've made these 3 training decisions, maybe at this point you know you want to train 3 times per week, full body with moderate volume and progressing intensity, then at this point it's way easier to choose exercises and set up a program. Now is when you can start thinking about back squat versus front squat, barbell versus dumbbell bench press, dips versus tricep extension, and things like that. Those decisions should be fairly easy once you have the main structure of your training. So lastly, you'll want to decide if you want to include plyometrics, mobility work, or conditioning work into your program. Rather than just deciding on this randomly, think back to the results of your assessment. If you had a mobility restriction in one hip and one shoulder movement, they may only need 2 mobility exercises. Don't add 20 just because. Instead, be specific and test and retest. Similarly, if their conditioning test revealed a need for lactate threshold for their sport and they tested with a low value, then you can program threshold-specific conditioning work every Wednesday for 6 weeks. Maybe that involves 8 minutes of running with 2 minutes of rest 4 times, with the goal to increase running pace each week. When the athlete retests, they will see an improvement in lactate threshold. As you can see, this systematic approach will get you consistent, measurable results that your athletes will see and feel. I've used this approach with hundreds of athletes, and I know that it will work for you too. Okay, lastly, let's cover pillar number 3, and that is recovery. I think a lot of people make mistakes here by immediately focusing on passive recovery modalities, like the sauna or the cold plunge or massage. Now these can be effective, and I'll actually share which ones I think are most effective and least effective in a little bit, but first I want to cover the piece that a lot of people are missing, and that is using training as recovery. For example, low intensity, low impact aerobic work like an easy spin bike session can increase blood flow, cardiovascular health, and contribute to aerobic fitness and conditioning. This active recovery built into a program can go a lot farther than relying on passive recovery modalities. Similarly, a mobility or a movement prep session can improve mobility while also providing mental relaxation and preparation. A lot of athletes these days start training while answering emails or checking social media, and they end up distracted in the gym. This leads to lower motivation and lower outputs, lower bar speeds, and higher perceived effort required for a training session. That's why I often provide my clients with a brief, simple routine that can involve something as simple as a 5-minute walk and 5-minute movement prep with no distractions at the start of a training session. This helps them mentally shift gears into a training mindset. Remember, the athlete's experience isn't just the exercise and the sets and reps on paper, it's the entire environment that you set up. And I find that this setup with mental preparation and movement prep is especially helpful for my online training clients, which need a higher degree of focus and preparedness to be consistent. So I would encourage you and your athletes to build in these routines to become mentally and physically ready to train, leading to less burnout and less need for recovery. That said though, if you do want to do some work on recovery specifically, I think some of the more overrated techniques can include a sauna, which sometimes can feel good but often dehydrates athletes, as well as random foam rolling and lazy mobility work, which isn't targeted or specific and there's no testing involved. Those things I would avoid, but some recovery techniques that I do think have good research to support their benefits include massage and, surprisingly, compression boots, like Normatec or something like that. And of course, post-training nutrition, including protein and carbs, and sleep, things like that are very important as well. All right. To summarize, with Pillar 1, we learned the basics of assessing athletes' movement and performance to determine what each unique athlete needs. In Pillar 2, we learned how to choose training frequency, training volume, and progressions to move the athlete towards their goals. In Pillar 3, we learned how to structure training with recovery in mind to ensure the athletes make consistent progress without burnout. If you do these 3 things well, I think you're gonna get your athletes great results and you're gonna have more athletes ready to work with you. I'll leave a link below to our Hip Mobility Masterclass, as well as our full courses and training programs if you wanna check those out to learn more. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.